Hi, and welcome to this bonus extra lecture for Shell Shock on Fragments and Ruins, Europe After Versailles, and on T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, our optional reading for week 3. In this lecture, I want to start, as we started a little bit in week 1, with a combination of images. On the left, we have pictures of the devastation of France and Belgium. On the ground, toward the end of the war, notice the blasted out trees, the makeshift bridge over newly formed rivers made by bombs, the crumbling tower, the collapsed houses. We can already start to imagine the collapse of something bigger, like an old political order, just by looking at these kinds of photos. And then we turn to the right, and on the right, we see political maps of how Europe would change from 1914 at the start of the war to 1920 at the signing of the Versailles Treaty. The images on the left, where new landscapes are being created, are not far from new borders that are made on the right, where France would take Alsace-Lorraine and occupy the Rhineland. But farther east on the map, we have something closer to the equivalent of completely exploded new territory. With the fall of four empires, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires, we have all these new borders and new countries springing up: Czechoslovakia, Poland, Yugoslavia, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. These are two completely disorienting transformations at two different scales. In the West, collapsed cities, bombed out fields, barbed wire, dead vegetation. In the East, the barbed wire of new borders and nationalities. To belabor this point just a little bit further, here are some aerial pictures of the land in Belgium and France, pockmarked with bombs or run through with trenches. Those fissures on the right are artificial borders carved into the Western Front. And then here are some new maps of Eastern Europe and the Middle East, marking the creation of new political borders, not just in the Balkans, but around Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and other states, other new states. In sum, it's hard to overstate how dramatically these parts of the world had transformed in just about 6 years, from the start of the war through the terms of peace. Here's the moment of the signing of the peace, as painted by the Irish artist William Orpen. We are in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, and in the close-up on the right, we get our main characters: the American President Woodrow Wilson, the French President Georges Clemenceau, the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. In front of them, with their backs turned to us, the Germans are signing. Um, Most infamously, the treaty that the Germans are signing includes Article 231, which specifies that, quote, Germany accepts the responsibility for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. This was the clause later known as the War Guilt Clause that justified the need for German reparation payments. And it was the clause that would divide the Allies' opinion of the treaty while stoking German resentment. And if you sense that Orpen himself, in painting this commemoration, has misgivings about the treaty, you're probably right. There's something shifty about the looks that Orpen has given the major players here, and criticism of the architects of the treaty was immediate. T.S. Eliot evokes this scene with a similar skepticism in his poem Garantian, written about the same time of the treaty. After such knowledge, what forgiveness? Think now. History has many cunning passages, contrived corridors, and issues, deceives with whispering ambitions, guides us by vanities. This is not explicitly a set of verses about Versailles, but it's hard not to see the Hall of Mirrors when you read this. Two of the most vocal opponents of the treaty were the General Ferdinand Foch, who had been a Supreme Allied commander during World War I, and John Maynard Keynes, a delegate of the British Treasury to the Paris Peace Conference, who had resigned in protest. You read a little bit of that for this lecture, or you had the option to. From a military perspective, Foch made two chilling predictions at the end of the treaty. This is not a peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. And the next time, remember, the Germans will make no mistake. They will break through into northern France and seize the channel ports, at a base of operations against England. And he was pretty much exactly right. From an economic perspective, Keynes was worried that the treaty was going to lead to poverty and famine across Central and Eastern Europe. He wrote down his dissent in a book he published in 1919 titled The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which became a massive international hit, selling 100,000 copies and being translated into 11 languages in its first year. Keynes characterized the crusade of revenge that the French wanted as a Carthaginian peace, recalling the ancient Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage, when Rome had notoriously salted the fields of North Africa after victory to prevent its enemy from ever recovering. Keynes had lots of vivid descriptions of the deliberations in Paris and the consequences for Europe, and here's one of the most memorable from within our reading. In Paris, where those connected with the Supreme Economic Council received almost hourly the reports of the misery, disorder, and decaying organization of all Central and Eastern Europe, of the terrible exhaustion of their countries, an occasional visit to the hot, dry room in the president's house, where the four fulfilled their destinies in empty and arid intrigue, only added to the sense of nightmare. Keynes was warning that starvation and poverty from Austria and Russia would lead to widespread revolution, and the old men sitting with George Clemenceau couldn't see the disaster that was coming. We know that Eliot was an avid reader of Keynes's book, and you can hear echoes in his poems Gerontian and The Wasteland of these Keynesian descriptions. And Keynes had a big impact on London literary circles in general. Robert Graves and Virginia Woolf were both very impressed by this book, and other associated historians began advocating for revisions to the treaty. In some important ways, Keynes was right to worry. The period after World War I was marked by continued conflicts that threatened the new order, along with old empires and Western democracy itself being threatened. The years after 1918 were marked by the Greco-Turkish War, the Irish War of Independence, the Russian Civil War, just to name a few. We will get into more of that later. But it's also worth saying that Keynes also got some things wrong. He overestimated the economic damage to Central Europe in the long run, and his arguments fueled nationalist resentment without always accurately describing the problem. We'll see a little bit of that if you look at the beginning of Riefenstahl's propaganda film next week. So you might think a little bit here about what struck you most, just in terms of this book as a document about Keynes's assessment of the situation in Europe and how he writes about it, right? Is it his call to leave English interests aside and become European, a new kind of internationalist mindset? That's a striking phenomenon at this time, in line with the creation of the League of Nations. Is it his sweeping rhetoric about the possible destruction that is to come? Is it his suggestion to try to court Germany away from Russia, which is prescient of post-World War II policy? Is it his literary references to Tolstoy, Hardy, and Shelley from Prometheus Unbound? You might start to take stock of some phrases of his that could have been useful to a poet like Eliot. Phrases like, "The French and British peoples have run the risk of completing the ruin. Europe's voiceless tremors do not reach her, the mingled significance and unreality of the decisions, the tragicomic masks of some drama or puppet show, the air whispered, the word was not flesh." These voiceless tremors, unreality, unreal, the air fiddling whispers, all of these things show up in some form in Eliot's poem. But for our purposes, the most important lines might be these. "The events of the coming year will not be shaped by the deliberate acts of statesmen, but by the hidden currents flowing continually beneath the surface of political history, of which no one can predict the outcome. In one way only can we influence these hidden currents, by setting in motion those forces of instruction and imagination which change opinion. The true voice of the new generation has not yet spoken, and silent opinion is not yet formed. To the formation of the general opinion of the future, I dedicate this book." So Keynes is crediting himself ambitiously as being one of the forces of instruction here, but he's also making the call for forces of imagination to join him, the true voice of a new generation. That is a call, I think, to artists and poets to shape the new world in a way that maybe the statesmen failed. And the idea of hidden currents flowing continually continues a metaphor of drought and water that will appeal to new generational voices like Eliot. So in the spirit of the other lectures we had so far, I want to use this preamble about Versailles to pose a general question for our discussion today, inspired by those phrases of Keynes. What exactly are these new forces of instruction and imagination that followed directly from Versailles? How did the Versailles Treaty itself inspire new ideas in the arts? And I'm going to start very quickly with three countries that were especially dissatisfied with the treaty and where a cultural revolution did take place in the aftermath of the peace conference: China, Germany, and Russia. And then from there, we will get to The Wasteland, but also a related poem that's actually much more specifically about the Paris Peace Festival, or the Peace Carnival, as the poem calls it, which is Hope Marelyse's Paris. I'll upload that if you're curious to read it. Since this is already an optional lecture, I didn't assign it, but it is short, even if it's very complicated, like Eliot's poem. And this will give us two examples of this form that we might call the modernist long poem that arises in the early 1920s, maybe even the late 1910s. We might think of Hugh Selwyn Moberly as also participating in this genre, or Anna Akhmatova's poem Without a Hero, or indeed her Requiem, which we're going to touch on later. So I've been focusing on Europe mostly in this lecture, but it's important to remember that the Paris Peace Conference also had important ramifications around the world, including Africa and Asia. And one particularly controversial choice was to award the territory of Shandong in eastern China, which had been a German colony, over to Japan, which had joined the Allied powers during the war, instead of giving that territory to China. This decision mobilized a young generation of students that was already fed up with the traditions of Chinese society, which went out in protest on May 4th, 1919, starting the May 4th movement. The revolt combined politics and culture, calling for new standards in poetry and the arts. The cultural side of the movement centered around an influential literary journal known as New Youth. So we think about that new generation. In that journal, the poet Hu Xi outlined a manifesto for new Chinese literature, starting with these listed manifesto claims, a little like the Futurist Manifesto, but with different aims. Write with substance, do not imitate the ancients, and then working his way in the final ones to do not use couplets and parallelism, do not avoid popular expressions or popular forms of characters. So upholding everyday speech and against old literary conventions. This manifesto predates the Versailles Treaty, it should be said, but the May 4th movement gives it momentum and gives momentum to literary reform. So this is one way of responding to the upheaval of the 1910s. The New World Order wipes clean the slate in politics and in culture, so we can throw away imperial traditions, make art that is new, based in common language and present experience, a sort of self-determination in the arts on democratic terms. Post-war Germany saw its own explosion of intense political art in this period, riding the waves of Dadaism and Expressionism. These artworks were often satires of the commercial and political class, which artists blamed for having sold out the youth during the war. So this collage by Hannah Höch, created in 1919 during the year of the Versailles Treaty, has been interpreted as its own reaction to the peace conference. In the same way that the victorious imperial powers were slicing up German territory, Höch imagines herself slicing up her country culture with a kitchen knife to make this collage. In the top right, she includes an image of Kaiser Wilhelm II among the industrial wreckage, along with German politicians of the new Weimar Republic as the anti-Dadaists, so the enemy of her anarchist art movement. On the bottom left, photos of crowds gather around an assassinated communist, Karl Liebknecht, brought back to life in this image to proclaim, join Dada, sort of aligning what Dada politics are. And it's important to remember that important representatives at the Paris Peace Conference included European labor leaders emboldened by the Bolshevik Revolution who were able to make strides for labor reform. You can find a whole great breakdown of this particular image, I should say, by the art historian Karen Barber online. And I'm drawing on that to kind of make some of these observations. And naturally, one could get lost in all kinds of other details of what is included in this collage, but the chaos of the collage to me is kind of the point. Höch is trying to capture the energy of a country and a world that seems to have gone to pieces, left for artists to reassemble. To figure out how these new pieces fit together, whether that's pieces of borders or pieces of land or pieces of culture. And at a glance, you might recognize that Einstein is pictured on the top left. Lenin is there next to him, a map of women's suffrage on the bottom right, and where it has gained ground, while artists, workers, and machines are spread throughout the whole image, giving you some sense of just how revolutionary this period was or how it felt to artists, to scientists, to politicians. So this is maybe a second kind of response to the crisis of the 1910s. Faced with a world in ruins, make art that reassembles the fragments. And then one of the most striking cultural revolutions in this period is happening in revolutionary Russia, as you might expect, where the avant-garde feels that it has a role to play in the construction of a new state. Amid the varied expressions of the Soviet avant-garde, which we'll cover a little bit more next week in the other optional lecture, there's an overt response to Versailles in Vladimir Mayakovsky's poem 150 Million. Mayakovsky's poem describes a world revolution embodied by a mythical Russian Superman named Ivan, who fights Woodrow Wilson in Chicago in the World Class Struggle Championship final. It's a kind of darkly and violently political poem, but it's also sort of funny in the way that it allegorizes that struggle. So I'm happy to upload that too if you're curious to read it. So what are the Versailles elements in this poem? Well, Mayakovsky explicitly frames the whole piece as a response to the treaty, using Woodrow Wilson as a representative of capitalism and blaming the country's poverty and starvation, that is Russia's, on the greed of the West. when he says, "Listen up, Wilson, swimming in fat back. If men are to blame, then give them the punishment. But we didn't sign any treaty in Versailles. Russia was excluded from the treaty signing and wouldn't receive any reparations that were promised to Western Europe." It's also worth remembering, of course, that Russia is fighting a civil war at the time that Mayakovsky is writing this poem, in which the Americans and their allies were supporting the white armies against Lenin's new government. So there is not just a fictional boxing match to imagine Chicago. There's a real fight happening here. Later in the poem, Mayakovsky will expand this critique not just to Wilson, but also to Lloyd George and Clemenceau. And then he turns to the big confrontation in the poem, and he writes, "The world staggered redly like a volcano, only there was no such volcano on the map drawn by the old geographers. The entire universe, not some pathetic little Etna, a crater spewing out nations like lava, bellowing as they rushed across erased countries. The living and the dead fled from the downpour of lava." An apocalyptic vision of the new world created by the new geographers, those who had recharted the map. Notice the way the old maps become obsolete, with nations spewed into existence or other countries erased. And notice, too, how the dead and the living mingle and move together as migrant populations. These are details we will see repeated in the poems by Mirrlees and Eliot. But above all, I want to show you the final lines of Mayakovsky's poem, which tell us the genre that Mayakovsky wants to emulate. He writes, "It's for you. The bloody Iliad of revolutions, the Odyssey of hungry years is for you." So we touched on this a little bit in the war poet sequence, how Homer sort of lingers in the background. This came up in a few discussion posts, but it's quite explicit at the end of Mayakovsky's epic. I'm just going to say he too, I think, is trying to write a kind of epic. At one point, he describes the warrior Ivan, this allegorical Russian warrior, as a Trojan horse filled with smaller revolutionaries, sort of Matryoshka doll. But these final lines really give the game away. In broad terms, the Iliad is a war poem about some of the final battles of the Trojan War, and the Odyssey is a post-war poem about suffering, about the return of warriors. And what Mayakovsky suggests to Russia is that we have lived through both epics in the last 10 years. We've lived through the Iliad of World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution, and now we are living through the Odyssey of starvation and of civil war. And in that light, the poem 150 Million is an attempt to write a new epic poem to forge a new national identity. This has traditionally been another possible poetic response to great wars. Epic poems often create a sense of new national identity around mythical retellings of old or recent battles, just as Virgil did in Rome after the Civil War of Actium when he wrote the Aeneid. This gives us another possible artistic response to World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. For a country that is either recovering or still in the midst of fighting, as Russia was, a poet can try to rally national identity around epic scale and epic verse. So, to recap where we are so far, here are the different kinds of responses that certain poets and artists came up with after World War I and Versailles. We've got in China the principle of throwing aside the old imperial traditions and listening to contemporary democratic voices. In Germany, we've got the idea of sifting through the ruins of culture and trying to reassemble the fragments. In Russia, we've got the possibility of writing new poetic epics that are appropriate for a post-war moment. And perhaps now you have guessed where this is going. But the argument that I want to make going forward is that T.S. Eliot and also Hope Mirrlees, in their efforts to create a new genre of the modernist long poem, combine all three of these insights. Even though Eliot shares none of the particular politics of Chinese New Youth or the German Dadaists or the Russian communists, he hits upon a synthesis of these diverse artistic responses, and Mirrlees' Paris does too. These are poems that pit ancient material against modern voices, juxtapose cultural fragments, and try to update tropes from Homer, or at least from ancient epic. To orient ourselves before we begin with The Wasteland and the modernist long poem, I want to begin with a very famous modernist short poem by Eliot's primary collaborator, Ezra Pound. This two-line poem from just before World War I in 1913, titled In a Station of the Metro, "The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough." Maybe some of you have come across this before. It's eminently memorizable at only 2 lines, so you can take it with you from here on. We could say that this tiny poem is already trying to test out in a compressed form the 3 experiments we just described, even as a pre-war poem. It's new, it's fragmentary, and it's also got a strange debt to ancient epic. Pound had the vision for this poem when he was getting off the Concorde subway station in Paris, and he talks about how he was inspired by Japanese haiku poetry to compose it. And that's one recognizable strategy for modernist poems in this era, to look for foreign sources of inspiration to renovate Western literature. Just like New Youth was looking to European texts to renovate Chinese literature, and just like that Alfred Barr diagram was showing how modern art was making use of foreign borrowings or foreign thefts. But in that description that Pound gives, he's also hiding the fact that he was drawing from one of the most famous images in all of Western literature, the Western canon. In Virgil's Aeneid, when the hero Aeneas is about to cross the river into the underworld as part of his journey, he sees a crowd of ghosts on the bank. The lines go, in English, a huge throng of the dead came streaming toward the banks, as thick as leaves in autumn woods at the first frost that slip and float to earth. And then the Italian poet Dante in the Middle Ages gets around all kinds of references to Virgil, since Virgil is, of course, his guide through the underworld, through the Inferno and Purgatory. And so he does his version of these lines too, quite famously. As in autumn the leaves remove themselves one after the other until the branch sees all its raiment on the ground, so the evil seed of Adam throw themselves from that shore one by one. In the poetic tradition, this journey to the underworld is known as katabasis, from the words for down going in Greek. And Pound knows all about this, but he brings back to life one of the great poetic tropes of the past, sort of subtly and secretly, when he does this in his two-line poem. The crowd of the underworld as leaves on a branch, or in this case, flowers. In 1913, this might be little more than just a bit of kind of artistic cleverness and pretension, right? Modern cities have their own underground riverbanks, like the platform of the Paris Metro, so the image naturally springs to mind for a classically trained poet. But after World War I, this idea of a modern city having a living surface world and an underground world of the dead becomes a little bit more vivid, a little bit more haunting, a little bit more real. Now there are millions of newly dead soldiers underneath the ground, some having never received a proper burial. So a few modernist poets began to expand on Pound's miniature poem and create their own epics out of the idea of a modern catabasis, a visit to the dead within a modern city. There's that word. Okay, I'm going to move quickly through this since Eliot is the main event, but if you're curious as to unpuzzling the difficulties of Hope Mirrlees's very similar poem, Paris from 1920, we might look at this opening page and its kind of fragmentary Dadaist nature, where she uses this strange word at the beginning. I want a hollow phrase, nord-sud, zigzag, lion noir, cacao bleu coeur, black figured vases in Etruscan tombs, Rue du Bac, du Bonnet, Solferino, du Bonnet, Chambre de Députés. What is happening here? Breck, 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 coax, coax, we are passing under the Seine. Du Bonnet, the Scarlet Woman shouting beer and deafening Saint John at Patmos. Vous descendez, madame? Qui souvent se pèse bien se connaît, qui se connaît bien, oh, sorry, qui bien se connaît bien se porte. Concorde. Okay, so all kinds of nonsense, different languages, especially French. What exactly is happening here? What is this disorienting first poem? Well, at least on one level, the speaker is taking the subway. So we've got another subway poem and a subway poem that actually ends at the same station as Pound's vision. So we are here on the north-south A, what was the north-south A line in Paris at the time. We're passing by posters, the Black Lion, Zigzag cigarettes, Blucher's Cocoa. And we see we're passing under the river. There's the Seine. We've got this ad, this beer ad. So we've got all these different things that are just kind of gathered from sense impressions, and at the same time, there's something personal and sort of metaphysical going on. The opening statement, "I want a hollow phrase," meaning I want a single word that could synthesize several ideas, suggests that there are multiple levels of meaning being synthesized here. We can trace a kind of catabasis in all the classical and medieval references that the poem is doing as well. The north-south line is maybe representative of an underworld journey, like Dante's. That might also explain why we are meeting kind of a great cat, a lion, or a leopard, or a panther on our way to hell, like Dante does. We've got several ancient images of death, the Etruscan tombs and croaking of frogs in the Breck, Breck, Breck coax from ancient Greek comedy, the sulfur evoked by Solferino. And instead of a red woman selling drinks, we have the whore of Babylon, perhaps, suggesting an apocalypse. That might be another version of who's on that beer poster, the Scarlet Woman. And instead of a scale, the penultimate lines of like, who weighs themselves well knows themselves well. Who does it well knows how. Who knows themselves well knows how to comport themselves is sort of the penultimate lines there. So it's kind of written on a scale in the Metro if you want to weigh yourself. Well, so we might think of like the scales of the underworld, perhaps an Egyptian myth, scales of judgment. In general, that's how these modern poems work. They layer recognizable objects and the sights of everyday city life with references that open up other meanings and other worlds. So by the time somebody asks, Vous descendez, madame? Are you descending, madam? The phrase is loaded with at least two possibilities, right? Are you literally descending into the subway? Are you getting off the subway car? Or are you descending into some kind of underworld to meet history and go visit the past? And as I was saying with Pound, we can see how Marylise is using multiple strategies for creating a new kind of poem. She uses contemporary language of advertisements, subway stops, overheard speech. She juxtaposes different fragments to give an impression of the energy of modern life. And she layers on epic narratives of the afterlife and the end of the world. And then the fact that she gets off at Concorde is an attempt maybe to superimpose these layers. The Place de la Concorde evokes the sight of the guillotine and the survival of post-revolutionary Paris. Now the idea of Concorde evokes a new threat to peace and a new place where peace is being made. Not to mention, of course, the Concorde of trying to bring together these disparate images themselves. So one more little slide on Miralise's poem, just to kind of invite you to go take a look at it. As the speaker of that poem wanders through Paris, she is also wandering in time through the spring months of 1919, which means that this is very much a Versailles text, as much as Mayakovsky's. It's a poem that takes place specifically during the Paris Peace Conference. So if you read it and you look at the notes, you'll see references to President Wilson, to the 8-hour work bill, to an assassin, a would-be assassin of Georges Clemenceau, to the strikes of the 1st of May among the laborers. And Miralise refers to all of this explicitly at one point on page 12 of her poem as a peace carnival, where the peace conference intersects with the Catholic holidays of Mardi Gras and Shrovetide. And I think the word carnival gives us a helpful way to think about Miralise's poem as a whole, with its layers of ordinary life and ancient history. The carnival in the Catholic tradition is a period of celebration before deprivation, before Lent, and historically the period where the rich and powerful let the masses take over the city. That is, the carnival is a brief period where everything is permitted and society is upside down before order is restored. Paris 1919 is a little bit like that, right? We've got the international power brokers who are gradually determining a new world order, but in the meantime, there are celebrations of the armistice along with rituals of grieving out in the streets. And we've got, these tombs for unknown soldiers, an invention of this particular period, gathering some of these assemblies. Miralise recognizes that Paris, which is momentarily the capital of the world, politically, feels like a place where anything is possible, but it's also a place of mourning and anxiety and frivolity. Inevitably, carnivals end when the fasting starts, a period of poverty, of famine, of unpopular laws, and all these things are at risk of overtaking Europe. So, some little bits of the poem that bring this up. Miralise's thoughts on Paris as a post-war city are scattered in the poem, but there is a sustained reflection on page 10 to 11 if you go and read it. The Roman legions, winged, invisible, fight their last fight in Gaul. The ghost of Père Lachaise is walking the streets. He is draped in a black curtain embossed with the letter H. He is hung with paper wreaths. He is beautiful and horrible, and the close friend of Rousseau, the official of the Douane. The unities are smashed. The stage is thick with corpses. Kind, clever Gaillard, their idola in hideous frames, inset with the brass motto, Mort au champ d'honneur. So let's break this down just a little bit. First, we have the last fight in Gaul, perhaps a reference to the war to end all wars, or maybe to the ongoing deliberations of peace in France. Then we have the ghost of Paris's most famous cemetery, Père Lachaise, carrying the tributes that are left for the dead. And then Miralise starts to comment on art itself. The unities refer to an idea that literature should adhere to certain classical rules, like a tragedy that takes place in a single day around a single event. The fact that these unities are smashed says a lot about this poem. Miralise is tracking multiple events over multiple days, and she needs to break with the old ways of writing to do so. And then finally, she thinks of the young men, the gaillards, who have been turned into shades, the idola, commemorated with the euphemism dead on the field of honor, mort au champ d'honneur, which simply means in military speak, killed in action. So you can think a little bit about what the effect is of having these thoughts brought together, expressed in this particular way. But you see how the modernist long poem assembles these kinds of fragments and makes a montage or a collage of these different kinds of elements to get something out of the juxtaposition. And that prepares us for the wasteland. So Miralise's poem ends fairly optimistically. The final page gives us a sunrise, babies being born, a constellation of stars in the sky, which is also what Dante sees when he emerges from hell. But the poem as a whole, with its impressions of a city that is haunted by the dead, taken over by foreigners, subject to stirrings of labor revolution, should leave us a little bit uneasy. And this is all set up to think about Eliot's poem, which by comparison with its famous Sanskrit ending, is at least ambiguous, if not a little bit more dour. We'll come back to that ending at the end of the lecture. So Paris and the Wasteland have a bit of a strange history together, these two poems. Virginia Woolf's press published each of them in London, starting in 1920 with Miralise and then The Wasteland in a late edition in 1923. Paris ran only 175 copies and was almost completely forgotten for decades, whereas Eliot's poem has become one of the most famous of the 20th century. Miralise and Eliot did become friends later in the 1920s, and Eliot helped publish some of Miralise's biographical work. But there's no commentary from either of them about the connection between these two poems, despite the fact that they look very similar. It's possible that Eliot read Miralise's poem as he started to develop ideas for his, but we've never found specific evidence for this. So the other possibility remains, however striking, that they somehow arrived at their ideas for modernist epics independently, perhaps inspired by common French sources, like The Cape of Good Hope by Jean Cocteau is one possibility. But in the end, we've got two very similar modernist long poems, each preoccupied with the fate of post-war Europe after Versailles, each imagining cities haunted by the dead, each playing with fragments and quotations, one based in Paris, one based in London. Let me take just a pause here as we get going with The Wasteland. A good way to start with Eliot's poem is to think about how Eliot himself wanted to start it. Originally, Eliot was going to title the work He Do the Police in Different Voices, a quotation from Charles Dickens, our mutual friend, describing a boy who reads the newspaper out loud with different impressions. I think we're all grateful that he didn't pick that title, and maybe the poem wouldn't be as widely read if he had. Um, that gives us at least some sense of how Eliot originally conceived the poem, though, as a cacophony of voices taking turns speaking. And that might remind us of the other Versailles responses we've seen earlier. Perhaps like the Chinese poet Hu Shi, Eliot wants to make poetry out of contemporary speech and overheard dialogue, as in his bar scene at the end of part two. Or perhaps like the German Dada artist Hannah Höch, he wants to see what happens when you splice different voices together, as in the end of part three of The Wasteland, when Eliot combines the Buddhist fire sermon with the Confessions of St. Augustine. Or perhaps like the Russian poet Vladimir Mayakovsky, maybe Eliot wants to let the voices of the past, verses of older poetry, epic poetry, give structure to this modern vision of the world. But in any case, Eliot dispensed with that Dickens title, probably smart that he did, and instead gives us The Wasteland. And you can think just at the outset, what exactly has been wasted? What waste do we witness? But of course, it is scattered throughout the poem. I'm putting up a handout of 13 ways of looking at the wasteland, and then another handout that kind of goes even deeper into six kind of major modes of interpretation that might give you some possibilities, some theories as to what the title is doing. So the wasteland could certainly be a reference to ancient beliefs about the dead land of winter, specifically found in books like James Frazer's The Golden Bough, where priests would sacrifice a king or an effigy to a god as part of a fertility ritual to welcome back the spring and grow things out of dead land. Or Eliot might be referring to a spiritual wasteland, searching for some kind of religious sense of direction against the moral decay of contemporary London. The wasteland might be more figurative. But given the theme of this lecture and our focus on war literature, I'm going to look at this poem and its wasteland more specifically as an account of post-war Europe. And I'm going to borrow from some arguments by the critic Eleanor Cook. Going back to the photographs from the start of the lecture, there are lots of moments where Eliot seems inspired by the physical landscape of war-torn Europe as the basis for his wasteland. Lines like April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, the famous opening lines. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? At lines 19 and 20. I think we are in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones. The river's tent is broken. The last fingers of leaf clutch and sink into the wet bank. The wind crosses the brown land unheard. Who are those hooded hordes swarming over endless plains, stumbling in cracked earth, ringed by the flat horizon only? And in the faint moonlight, the grass is singing over the tumbled graves about the chapel. Eliot didn't witness the war himself, but no doubt he would have seen some of these photographs, as well as paintings and other descriptions of the territory. And he is he's certainly going to be drawing from Keynes's descriptions of Europe, metaphorical and literal as well. And the wasteland is also interested in the other set of images that we started with, right? The political borders of Europe, especially after the war. We get this interesting constellation of different references to the territory of Europe. Bin gar keine Russin, stamm aus Litauen, echt Deutsch. Not a Russian, I'm from Lithuania, genuinely German. The first snatch of foreign language we get in this poem is a muddled one. Lithuania changed hands from Russia to Germany in 1917 before becoming an independent state after the war, and Eliot makes us a little apprehensive about how borders are crossing over peoples who don't feel that they fit ethnically. We've got a little bit of more German here. Frisch weht der Wind, der Heimat zu, mein Irish Kind, wo weilest du? Fresh blows the wind to the homeland, my Irish child, where do you wait? In this other bit of German taken from Wagner, Eliot draws our attention to Ireland, a country in the midst of a revolutionary war against the United Kingdom. And again, the question of trying to find one's true homeland, Heimat, comes up. In part three, we meet this strange character, Mr. Eugenides, the Smyrna merchant, asked me in demotic French to luncheon at the Cannon Street Hotel, followed by a weekend at the Metropole. Smyrna was occupied by Greek forces in 1919 and retaken by Turkey in 1922 during the Greco-Turkish War that followed from the Great War. The Allies supported the Greek claim at first, but international support waned in light of ethnic violence. Eliot doesn't evoke all of this, of course, but in his position as a London banker, he gives us a different perspective, the ties that London has with the Mediterranean based on trade. Here's a weird one. Wea la la lea, wa la la lea la la. How could this possibly be a political reference? It sounds like nonsense. But Eliot insists in his notes that he is quoting from the Song of the Rhine Maidens in Wagner's Ring Cycle operas. And that's significant because the Rhine Valley was occupied by the Allies after World War I as one of the major affronts of the Versailles Treaty to the German perspective. So the lament of German river nymphs who have lost their gold takes a new kind of significance in the 1920s. A very oblique reference, political reference, but one nevertheless, I think. And then something a little bit more explicit. What does that sound high in the air murmur of maternal lamentation with the associated note that Eliot gives us in his notes to part five? Eliot tries to give us an image of what for him is the cry of all of Eastern Europe as a site of destruction and mourning. He only really kind of explains this in the notes, which he appends to the poem. And he cites the writer Hermann Hesse. Already half Europe, at all events, half Eastern Europe is on the road to chaos. He quotes Hesse as having said. Eliot tells us that this chaos is part of the backdrop of the finale of his poem. So what does this tell us overall? That Eliot's Wasteland is a post-war poem, not just in the sense that it commemorates or responds to World War I, to 1914 to 1918, but because it knows that the conflicts are actually ongoing. It makes reference to ethnic violence, to anti-imperial revolutions, to nationalist resistance, to the mingling of economic interest with military occupation. This is a poem not only about having survived an apocalyptic event in the recent past, but anticipating a new apocalypse in the making. That might explain why we get this catalog of imperial capitals collapsing across history. Falling towers, Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London, unreal. Eliot seems to be looking out on the ruins of history and predicting that London could be next. So I mentioned earlier that Eliot ran in the same circles as John Maynard Keynes and read the economic consequences of the peace. Eliot worked in Lloyd's Bank in London at this time of his life, and one of his jobs was actually dealing with claims on debts relating to the peace treaties that were coming out of Paris. And he makes it very clear in his letters what he's reading and why it preoccupies him, as in this letter to his mother. I wonder if America realizes how terrible the condition of Central Europe is. I can never quite put Vienna out of my mind. And I have seen people who have been in Germany, and they are most pessimistic about the future, not only of Germany, but of the world. They say there is no hope unless the treaty is revised. I believe, by the way, that J.M. Keynes's The Economic Consequences of the Peace is an important book, if you can get hold of it. And in this very first book edition of The Wasteland, published in New York, the commentary on the jacket draws our attention to that dimension of the poem. This is the finest poem of this generation. It gives voice to the universal despair or resignation arising from the spiritual and economic consequences of the war. That can't be that phrase can't be a coincidence. That blurb lists lots of other reasons for the importance of the wasteland as well, including the spiritual consequences, not just economic ones, right? That's in the quote I just gave you. And in general, the wasteland moves so quickly between different voices, references, and sources that it can be hard to pin down a single object of attention. That's why it's possible to interpret this poem according to so many different general approaches, as in the handouts that I've given you. But as with Hope Mirrlees's Paris, there are certain moments where Eliot seems to hone in particular on a vision of how the modern city is haunted by the war that has just concluded. Not Paris for him, London. And there, in those moments, we can see how Keynes comes up even more explicitly, or I should say specifically. So, like this section from the end of part one. Let me read this in a moment. Unreal city. Under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many. I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs short and infrequent were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet, flowed up the hill and down King William Street to where St. Mary Woolnoth kept the hours, with a dead sound on the final stroke of 9. There I saw one I knew and stopped him, crying, Stetson, you who were with me at the ships in Mylai, that corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? Or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed? Oh, keep the dog far hence that's friend to men, or with his nails he'll dig it up again. You, hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère. Hypocrite reader, my likeness, my brother. So again, as we did with Mirrlees, we can trace two paths through these verses, one in contemporary London and one in medieval and classical history. So first of all, on the city side, the speaker is watching commuters go over London Bridge and up to the church of St. Mary Woolnoth. This is, in fact, right across the street from Eliot, where Eliot worked at Lloyd's Bank. And later, Eliot said that he imagined the name Stetson as the name of a bank clerk. So we might have some indication that the I in the stanza is Eliot himself for once. Usually the voices are others, but maybe here it's something more like his own perspective. Here are some images of London around this period where we might get a sense of what Eliot is describing. But then there's also an underworld element. Eliot is making these commuters and businessmen fit the language of Dante's Inferno. He uses two verses from the Inferno where Dante has just entered the underworld and is marveling at how many shades are to be found in the opening circles among the neutral souls and the souls in limbo, neither damned nor blessed. A funny bit of trivia here, actually, is that when Eliot published this poem with Virginia Woolf's Press in 1923, they accidentally printed the third line here as a crowd flowed under London Bridge, which seems kind of like an appropriate slip, like giving away the reference to the Inferno. But anyway, it's not meant to be under the bridge; it's meant to be over the bridge. And then when the speaker accosts Stetson, he talks about an ancient battle from the First Punic War, one of the great naval battles between Rome and Carthage, through which Rome annexed part of Sicily, but before Rome and Carthage would fight two more wars. And that's where things get a little bit interesting because in his very subtle way, Eliot is comparing London as an imperial financial capital to ancient Rome. And because he's been reading Keynes, he imagines London as having imposed its own Carthaginian peace, just as Rome did to the actual Carthage. Remember, so the legend was that Rome salted the fields in Carthage. And here, even though crops are unlikely to grow in Carthage or in Germany after the salting or after the economic revenge, Eliot imagines something else growing. That corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? And one way to read this climactic end, these final verses, is to say that the dead don't stay buried. Eliot, like Ferdinand Foch or like Keynes, worries that the corpses are going to bloom and that there's going to be a reckoning when they do. This maybe we can puzzle over together for those of you who meet for a sort of happy hour before class, what that final line, you hypocrite reader, my likeness, my brother, means in this particular context. Reading along with Keynes, reading along with Eliot, reading Baudelaire's Flowers of Evil, from which this line is plucked. What is going on there? But I'll leave that for now. Okay, so those two lines. That corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? That image could be described, I think, very well as the defining metaphor of the poem. After all, the wasteland begins with April breeding lilacs out of the dead land, And so much of the rest of the poem is about barren land waiting for rain so something can grow again. And we just had this conversation about what springtime brings and whether springtime in Charlotte Mews May from 1915 is optimistic or pessimistic. Here, there's also an ambiguity as to what the change of seasons will bring. Or, well, maybe ambiguity is even generous, given that April is the cruelest month in Eliot's rendering. Maybe spring is in fact merely sinister, and maybe the growth out of the dead land is itself merely sinister. In any case, this particular image allows Eliot to respond to some of the other poets we've been reading. Whereas Virgil and Dante evoke the dead with falling leaves, Eliot takes up the opposite view, imagining the dead sprouting from under the earth. And that image is a little bit closer to something like Isaac Rosenberg's line from last week, poppies whose roots are in man's veins, right? We talked a little bit about that. And in Eliot's own time, just a few years later, the specific image of a corpse blooming recalls, I think, as photographed here, the ritual of grieving, of public, civic, national grieving around, in Paris as in London, the tomb of the unknown warrior. A ritual initiated in Paris in 1919 that Mirrlees makes reference to, and then repeated in London in 1920, where an unknown body was perennially adorned with flowers. And that image becomes a political one in Eliot's poem when Eliot worries that the metaphorically salted fields of Central Europe will only nurture the seeds of resentment and grow something horrifying. Finally, the image works particularly well for the wasteland because Eliot's poem, with all of its quotations, is nothing if not a multitude of corpses blooming. Eliot is bringing back to life the spirits of Tristan and Isolde, of Dante, of Cleopatra, of the Rhine maidens, of Tiresias, of St. Augustine, of the disciples of the Upanishads, all so that they can look at the world as it is today and offer their commentary on it as they rise from their graves. So I'll take a moment here, close to the end of this lecture, to return to our list of post-war literary ideas. So we can add what we've gained from Hope Mirrlees and T.S. Eliot to our account of what instruction and imagination might hold from Versailles and after Versailles. As I've been saying, Paris and the Wasteland combine some of the literary responses we saw in other contexts in other books, but they also contain new ideas as well. I think for Mirrlees, if you go and read it, this image of the Peace Carnival is really striking to me because I think it gives us reasons to be excited about a new Europe after Armistice, but it doesn't look away from signs of trouble. Hope Mirrlees' poem juxtaposes the energy of Paris with the ghosts of the past and the new international era that is being set forth by the treaty with the political restlessness of the people who are now being divided up into new territories. And I think she knows that post-war celebrations are possibly just the pretext for a kind of authoritarian return to order. That's how carnivals go. So yes, keep an eye on the carnival, keep an eye on the celebrations for what happens when the carnival ends, for what the future may hold. That might be a thesis of that poem, or at least an animating worry of that poem. And for T.S. Eliot, if Mirrlees is more oriented toward the future, Eliot is more oriented toward the past. He worries about what has happened to former empires in former moments of crisis. London, his London, may go the way of Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, and Vienna when the bodies of World War I sprout into new animosities. So maybe a thesis or an animating worry here. Keep an eye on those corpses for what the past may bring back. So I promised that the end of the lecture was going to converge with the end of the wasteland, and this is that moment. And of course, we've left so much of the wasteland untouched, and so I hope some people will come out to talk about it with me as a kind of bonus conversation before class in week 3. But hopefully this is just a good enough teaser for you to think about how the rest of the poem might relate to the war or the post-war world, or indeed, be interested in other things, other kinds of spiritual and social crises. But let's at least make some sense of how the poem ends. We can talk about the whole final stanza together when we get together, but what about the shanti, shanti, shanti that Eliot ends with in the final line? Eliot was certainly capable of lines that we might call tidier or punchier. He ends the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, his terrific debut poem, with the lines, "We have lingered in the chambers of the sea by sea girls wreathed with seaweed red and brown till human voices wake us and we drown." Those are some very striking rhyming lines. He would end The Hollow Men in a few years later after The Wasteland with the famous lines, "This is how the world ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper." But here he ends with something a little bit more mystifying and confusing. As he puts it, with a formal ending to an Upanishad, that is, to the Sanskrit tradition behind Hinduism, a mantra that closes a piece of scripture and that you say aloud at the end of a ritual. Eliot studied Sanskrit at Harvard, where he did a PhD on metaphysics and studied this material. And at this point in his life, he seems to be reaching for religious answers to some kind of personal angst. But he has yet to convert to Anglicanism, which he will do in 1927. So he's more of a spiritual and religious searcher right now than a committed conservative Church of England Christian, which he will become. So in the wasteland, in that searching moment, Eliot draws on one of the Upanishad scriptures called the voice of the thunder, or as Eliot translates it, what the thunder said. Um, that chapter tells us the story of the creator, Prajapati, creating a teaching to his three sets, or sorry, giving a teaching to his three sets of children, the gods, the human beings, and the asuras, demons or demigods. Prajapati gives each group the same syllable, da, and each group interprets it as a different command: give, sympathize, or control. And you will have picked up on this when reading part five of the poem and maybe looking at the notes, where Eliot gives us each of those three da words and reflects on each of those virtues: to give, to sympathize, or to control. But the point for our purposes is this, I think, that Eliot is prepared to give us a single sound and have it have multiple meanings for different audiences on the basis of the use of different voices. So when we see Shanti repeated itself three times, we are invited, I think, to read it in three different ways. In the Sanskrit context, the word is usually pronounced on auspicious occasions, so that that might be reason for us to be optimistic about this ending, feel that there is some kind of sunrise ahead. On the other hand, this phrase, this word, this repeated word, is usually preceded by a syllable of benediction, om, which Eliot leaves out. So perhaps we're missing a blessing that we're supposed to have with regard to this word of peace. And in any case, we are going to look at this ending in three contexts. So I'm gonna think of Shanti as having three meanings. So if one reference is to the Upanishads, that's just one of three. For another perspective, we can turn to Eliot's notes, right? Eliot tries to translate the Sanskrit word, funnily enough, by turning to a different source of scripture, Paul's letter to the Philippians from the New Testament. In Eliot's note, he basically translates Shanti as the peace which passeth understanding. Not exactly a translation, but as he describes it, an equivalent to this word. So here we have another reason for possible, optimism about the end of the poem. Eliot is citing a biblical verse that promises a divine peace. Moreover, Eliot seems to be making his own point about human wisdom, that the East and the West have both arrived at religious instruction that should be able to comfort us, and that they overlap and align and harmonize in certain places. And that connects the different peoples of the world together, even after a global war. That's a significant move for a post-war poem. But there is one more little twist here, like the om that's missing from Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. And that's that by choosing this very specific phrase from Paul's letter, the peace which passeth understanding, a kind of funny equivalent to choose for the Sanskrit word, Eliot is layering the past and the present one more time. And that's because in 1922, the peace which passeth understanding had a very different association. And here we are again, bringing back the Treaty of Versailles one final time. Critics like to joke about this treaty that it was the peace that passeth all understanding, as in a baffling peace agreement that defies comprehension. And so, at the very end of this book, at the very end of the long poem, The Wasteland, at the back of Eliot's notes, the sort of text within the text or the text after the text, we are mixing ancient references to Sanskrit scripture with Christian theology and this little uneasy, nervous joke about the present. We get one last reference to the Paris Peace Conference. In other words, I am arguing, The Wasteland ends the way the war has ended, with a tenuous, fragile, unsettled, unconvinced declaration of peace. Okay, so that's a little bit of framework, a little bit of guidance for thinking about T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. I hope some of you will come and talk about it with me. I hope for others it will just give you a general sense of different kinds of modernist reactions to World War I and the post-war world, in harmony or disharmony with Hemingway. But one way or the other, I hope you are inspired now to dig into some of the details of this poem. Eliot is deliberately difficult in that modernist mode of expecting a lot of knowledge of you, or if not, a lot of research of you. And the fun you can have with this poem is going deep with any one of these references and seeing how it branches out into all kinds of different associations. So I've done that now with the final line of the poem. Maybe you'll want to pick a different line of the poem for yourself and do some of that legwork of figuring out what kinds of things Eliot is alluding to beyond the most superficial reference. I think it is a kind of infinitely generative poem in that way. But I'll leave you with that. And hope you enjoyed this lecture and found it stimulating, and maybe hope even some of you are inspired to read Hope Mirrlees' Paris or Mayakovsky's 150 Million, or write a paper about one of these long poems for the end of the class. But let's leave it there. I'll stop the recording here.